When the silence finally settles between you and the narcissist, it doesn't arrive gently. It comes like a storm that has suddenly gone quiet, an unsettling calm where your mind races, your heart questions, and your spirit searches for something solid to hold on to. In that moment, you're not just dealing with the absence of contact, you're facing the echoes of everything you endured, everything you tolerated, and everything you tried to understand. And yet, deep within that silence, something powerful is being born, something that belongs to you, not them, something that is meant to guide you back to yourself. Because the truth is, when both you and the narcissist stop contacting each other, the silence isn't equal. One side sits in discomfort and the other sits in awakening. One side feels threatened by the loss of control and the other begins to rise from the emotional debris left behind. And this rise, your rise, is what truly terrifies the narcissist. When both you and the narcissist stop contacting each other, the silence that falls between you is not an equal experience. And this imbalance reveals everything you were never able to see clearly while the relationship was active. For you, the silence becomes a doorway, a space where healing begins, where your mind finally gets a chance to breathe, and where the emotional fog that once clouded your judgment slowly begins to lift. But for the narcissist, silence creates a very different internal earthquake. They don't experience peace, they don't experience reflection, they experience a slow and uncomfortable panic because silence is the one thing they cannot manipulate, control, or twist to their advantage. Your absence forces them into a psychological space that they are not equipped to handle because silence means they've lost what matters most to them: access. When the silence begins, the narcissist may outwardly appear calm, unbothered, even proud or triumphant. Their ego compels them to perform indifference, to pretend they initiated the distance, or to act as though your presence was never truly significant. But behind that performance, the truth is very different. Narcissists require constant emotional fuel, attention, reactions, emotional investment, and energy from others. They need to know they still have influence over your mind, your mood, and your decisions. Your silence disrupts that fuel supply. It forces them into an unfamiliar emotional territory where they are not in control, and this loss of control destabilizes them on a level that they will never admit. For you, the silence might feel painful at first. You may question your worth, wonder if they notice your absence, or fear that they moved on effortlessly. But as the days pass, you begin to feel something shifting inside you. You start to understand that the silence is actually working for you, not against you. Your mind, once tangled in emotional confusion, starts untangling itself. You no longer feel the constant pressure of navigating their unpredictable moods or decoding their mixed signals. In the quiet, your thoughts become clearer. You start noticing patterns you once overlooked. You begin understanding how deeply you were conditioned to respond, to fix, to explain, to justify, and to absorb blame that was never yours. And as your awareness deepens, so does your strength. You start realizing that the silence is restoring something the narcissist tried to take from you: your self-trust. Every moment you resist the urge to reach out, you rebuild a piece of your confidence. You begin to see that your emotional world is stabilizing, not collapsing. The quiet, open space for reflection, growth, and healing. What once felt like abandonment begins to feel like liberation. What once felt like loss begins to feel like clarity. Meanwhile, the narcissist is experiencing the silence in the opposite direction. For them, silence is not a path to growth, it is a threat. Their identity is built on external validation, so when you withdraw your attention, they feel an internal emptiness they cannot soothe alone. They begin wondering why you haven't tried to reach out. They question whether you've finally figured them out. They worry that they are losing control over the narrative, and this unsettles them more than losing the relationship itself. Narcissists don't fear losing people, they fear losing power, and your silence sends a message they cannot ignore. You are no longer reacting to them, and that means their influence is fading. This imbalance in how silence affects both of you reveals the real dynamic that was always present but often hidden. Your emotional world was genuine, vulnerable, and deeply connected, while theirs was driven by control, ego, and manipulation. The silence exposes this contrast more clearly than any confrontation ever could. It shows you that your pain came from caring too deeply, and their panic comes from realizing they are no longer the center of your emotional universe. Over time, this silence becomes a measurement of strength. You begin noticing that the longer you remain quiet, the more empowered you feel. You start valuing your peace more than their presence. You begin understanding that the silence is not something happening to you. It is something happening for you. And while the narcissist may attempt to break the silence later through manipulation, guilt, charm, or provocation, you are no longer standing in the same emotional place where they left you. You have evolved. You have understood, you have awakened. This is why the silence is never equal, because in that quiet, one person crumbles and the other rises. In the quiet that follows the end of contact with a narcissist, something profound begins to unfold inside you, something that could never happen while you were entangled in the chaos of their emotional demands. When the noise stops, when the arguments cease, when the manipulation no longer has space to echo, your mind is finally able to rest in a way it hasn't for a long time. This silence, though uncomfortable at first, becomes the environment where your awakening begins. You start reconnecting with parts of yourself you didn't even realize had gone missing. You start hearing your own voice again after months or years of being drowned out by theirs. And slowly, without force, without pressure, you begin reclaiming your clarity. There's a strange discomfort at first, because for so long you were conditioned to move, respond, fix, explain, justify, or defend. Narcissists train you to stay alert, to remain emotionally on guard, to anticipate their moods, to monitor their reactions, and to adjust yourself constantly. You lived in a form of psychological survival mode, even if you didn't see it clearly at the time. So when silence finally arrives, it feels like stepping out into the sunlight after spending too long in a dark room. It almost hurts. Your system doesn't trust it. Your mind doesn't know how to settle. But give it time, and slowly your nervous system begins to regulate. This is the early stage of your awakening. In the silence, you begin to notice the absence of emotional tension. You begin to realize that peace is not supposed to feel strange. You begin to understand that the constant feeling of something is off, which you experienced around the narcissist, was your intuition desperately trying to warn you. Once overridden by hope, love, fear, or denial, starts speaking louder now, and you are finally able to hear it. Every moment of quiet becomes a lesson. Every pause becomes clarity. Every stillness becomes a signal guiding you back to yourself. As the days pass, memories once blurred by emotional confusion start resurfacing with new meaning. You begin seeing the manipulation for what it really was. You begin understanding the cycles they used: love bombing to hook you, devaluing to weaken you, gaslighting to confuse you, stonewalling to punish you, and hoovering to pull you back in. Things you once blamed yourself for now appear in their true form, tactics designed to control you rather than love you. This awareness isn't painful, it's liberating, because every truth you uncover frees a part of your heart that was tied to them. And while you're awakening to truth, something else begins happening. You start remembering who you were before the relationship. You remember your laughter, your dreams, your boundaries, your energy, your identity. You remember how strong, intuitive, loving, and capable you were before the narcissist drained you emotionally. In many ways, the silence gives you back the parts of yourself that their chaos took from you. For the first time in a long time, you feel like you're coming home to yourself. You also begin understanding the difference between love and trauma bonding. You realize that what you thought was emotional intensity was actually emotional instability. What you interpreted as passion was actually manipulation. What you called connection was actually dependency created by psychological conditioning. This awakening doesn't break you, it heals you. Because recognizing the truth is the first step toward releasing the pain. In the silence, your emotions become clearer too. You begin differentiating between missing the person and missing the routine. You begin seeing that you weren't attached to who they truly were. You were attached to the hope that one day they would become who they pretended to be in the beginning. You begin acknowledging that the relationship was built on illusions, not realities. Every realization strengthens your emotional independence. And then something transformative happens. You stop personalizing their behavior. What once felt like your fault now becomes recognizable as their pattern. You stop taking responsibility for their moods. You stop feeling guilty for their unhappiness. You stop believing their projections. This mental shift is a major turning point in your awakening, because the moment you stop internalizing their behavior is the moment you reclaim your personal power. Your mind starts becoming clearer, stronger, and more grounded with each passing day. You no longer feel the urge to reach out for closure, because you finally understand that closure was never something they could give you. You no longer crave their validation, because your self-worth begins rebuilding from within instead of depending on their approval. In the silence, you grow. In the silence, you heal. In the silence, you awaken to what love should feel like and what it should never cost you again. This awakening is not sudden, it is slow, steady, and gentle. But once it begins, it cannot be stopped. The silence becomes your teacher, your mirror, and your guide. And as you reconnect with your intuition, your truth, and your inner strength, you step into a version of yourself that the narcissist hoped you would never discover, your powerful, healed, awakened self. When you and the narcissist both stop contacting each other, a very important truth begins to reveal itself. They not fear losing you as a person, they fear losing access to you. This distinction is one of the deepest, most painful, yet most liberating realizations you will ever make. And understanding it changes everything, because for so long you believed their reactions, their intensity, their anger, their sudden affection, and their emotional swings were signs of passion or attachment. You assumed their behavior came from a place of caring, even if expressed in unhealthy ways. But when the silence falls and they no longer have a direct line to your emotions, you begin to see the reality that was hidden beneath their tactics. Narcissists don't fear losing love, connection, or companionship. They fear losing control when you stop responding. The narcissist is confronted with the one thing they cannot manipulate: your absence. They are not built to handle silence, because silence means their tactics are no longer functioning. To them, control is everything. It is the fuel that keeps their ego inflated, the validation that makes them feel superior, the psychological anchor that keeps you tied to them emotionally. Losing that access is like watching their power drain drop to zero, and it terrifies them more than any breakup, confrontation, or argument ever could. They don't fear losing your heart. They fear losing the privilege of affecting it. This is why their behavior during silence is so contradictory. They may act indifferent on the outside, pretending your absence means nothing, claiming they've moved on or that they're unbothered. But beneath this facade, they are unsettled. Your silence disrupts the system they have relied on. They feel the loss of emotional leverage. They feel the gap where your reactions used to be. And even though they will never show it openly, they feel threatened by the idea that you may have gained clarity, strength, or independence. The narcissist's fear is rooted in loss of control, not loss of connection. When you were in contact, they could push your buttons, provoke emotions, demand explanations, or manipulate your empathy. They could drain your energy at will. But when you go silent, all of that stops. Their ability to alter your mental or emotional state disappears. They can no longer pull you into their world of chaos. They can no longer distort your reality or twist your emotions. And when that happens, their sense of power collapses. Your silence also forces them to confront something they desperately avoid: their own emptiness. Narcissists don't have stable self-worth. Without external attention, they begin to feel insignificant, invisible, and powerless. They depend on others to regulate their emotions, to feed their ego, and to give them a sense of identity. So when they lose access to you, a source that once provided them emotional fuel, they feel exposed, they feel unstable, they feel the emptiness they spend their entire life running from. But while they are panicking internally, you are beginning to understand just how much influence they once had over your emotions. You start recognizing how deeply they controlled your reactions, sometimes subtly, sometimes aggressively. You see how your happiness, sadness, confusion, and self-doubt were once tied to their behavior. Realizing this is painful, but it's also empowering, because once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Their illusion loses power, their control weakens, and their ability to manipulate you dissolves the longer the silence continues. There is a moment in this process when everything clicks. You realize that someone who truly loved you would not fear losing access. They would fear losing you. They would fear losing your trust, your companionship, your warmth, your presence. But narcissists do not think this way. To them, people are not partners, they are resources. When you pull that resource away, they feel deprived, not heartbroken. Understanding this truth liberates you from guilt. It stops you from personalizing their behavior. It frees you from thinking you did something wrong, because their fear of losing control has nothing to do with your worth and everything to do with their pathology. It is not your love that they miss, it's your availability. It is not your soul they crave, it's your reaction. And when that reaction disappears, they lose the emotional grip they once had. This realization becomes a turning point in your healing. You stop wondering if they cared. You stop hoping they will return changed. You stop waiting for closure, because you finally understand that what they valued was not your heart. It was your compliance, your emotional availability, your ability to be affected by them. Once this becomes clear, the silence transforms from something painful into something empowering. You begin to see that their fear is confirmation of your strength, not your weakness. You realize that the real power was never in their hands, it was in your reaction to them. And now that your reaction is gone, you hold the power they once tried desperately to control. This is the moment your healing accelerates. This is the moment clarity replaces confusion. This is the moment you understand the truth the narcissist hoped you would never discover. They were never afraid of losing you. They were only afraid of losing the version of you they could control. And now that version no longer exists. You've risen above it. You've awakened. You've reclaimed your strength. When the silence settles and the emotional fog begins to clear, one of the most eye-opening realizations you encounter is that you were never truly attached to the narcissist as a person. You were attached to the fantasy you created around them. This understanding is powerful because it shifts your entire perception of the relationship. For so long, you believed your emotional bond was built on love, connection, and mutual depth. But when both of you stop contacting each other and you step away from the emotional storm they created, you begin to see with painful clarity that the attachment you felt was not to who they consistently were, but to who they pretended to be, especially in the beginning. In the early stages of the relationship, narcissists present an idealized version of themselves. They mirror your values, your desires, your strengths, and your dreams. They study what you long for and reflect it back to you flawlessly. You believe you've met someone who understands you, someone who sees you, someone who aligns with your heart. But what you don't realize is that this version of them is a performance, a carefully constructed illusion designed to hook you emotionally, and it works because it's based on everything you genuinely hope for in a partner or relationship. This is where the fantasy begins. As the relationship unfolds, you find yourself holding on to the memories of those early moments even when their behavior starts to shift. They become inconsistent, cold, dismissive, manipulative, or unavailable. But your mind clings tightly to who they once appeared to be. You tell yourself that maybe stress changed them, maybe they're going through something, maybe if you give more, love more, understand more, they'll return to the version of themselves you first met. This longing for the initial illusion becomes the emotional glue that keeps you attached. Yeah. You're not bonded to reality. You're bonded to potential. You're bonded to hope. You're bonded to the belief that the person who once made you feel seen will come back if you're patient enough or understanding enough. But when communication stops, the fantasy can no longer be sustained. Silence has a way of removing the filters you once viewed them through. Without their words, their excuses, their manipulations, or their occasional affection to pull you back in, you begin to see the relationship in its actual form. You start questioning whether those loving moments were ever real or whether they were simply tools to secure your loyalty. You begin noticing how rarely their actions aligned with the image you held onto. And with each truth that surfaces, the fantasy dissolves a little more. As this happens, you realize that the pain you felt wasn't just from losing them, it was from losing the imagined version of them. You grieve the bond you thought you had, the future you envisioned, the emotional safety you believed was possible. But this grief, though heavy, is rooted in illusion. You're mourning what could have been, not what actually was. And acknowledging this is essential because it separates emotional truth from emotional distortion. In the silence, you start seeing patterns you missed. You remember the broken promises, the lack of accountability, the emotional distance masked by temporary affection, the way your love was taken for granted, and the way your empathy was used against you. You realize that the version of them you desperately held onto only existed in fragments, brief moments designed to keep you emotionally invested, and the rest of the time, their behavior contradicted everything you believed about them. With each moment of reflection, the fantasy becomes harder to hold on to, and the truth becomes more undeniable. You see that your attachment was born from emotional starvation. They gave just enough to keep you hoping, but never enough to build something real. This is why the silence becomes transformative. It forces you to confront the reality without the illusion standing in the way. It frees you from the emotional cycle that kept you trapped. And as the fantasy fades, something else emerges, clarity about yourself. You begin recognizing that your empathy, your capacity for love, your patience, and your hope were never weaknesses. They were strengths that the narcissist exploited. But now, without their influence clouding your judgment, those same qualities begin guiding you back to emotional truth and self-respect. You start understanding that real love doesn't require you to chase illusions. Real love doesn't confuse you, doesn't hurt you repeatedly, doesn't make you question your worth, and doesn't vanish when silence begins. The person you thought you loved was a mask, a projection, a performance. The real person beneath that mask was incapable of giving the love you deserved. This realization is painful, but it is also the moment healing truly begins, because once you understand that you were attached to the fantasy and not the reality, you no longer feel the urge to return. You no longer wait for their message, their apology, or their validation. You no longer cling to memories designed to manipulate your emotions. Instead, you reclaim your ability to see clearly, choose clearly, and love clearly. And with every truth you embrace, you step further away from the illusion and closer to the life and love you were always meant to experience. As the silence between you and the narcissist stretches longer, something powerful and unexpected begins to happen. You realize that your silence is no longer a reaction, a strategy, or a moment of emotional exhaustion. It becomes a boundary you never had before, a boundary you didn't know you were allowed to set, a boundary that protects your peace, your energy, and your healing. And this shift, this transformation of silence into strength, marks one of the most profound breakthroughs in your recovery. Because for the first time, the quiet you once feared becomes the quiet you choose. In the beginning, the silence feels heavy. You feel the urge to reach out, to seek closure, to explain yourself, or to express one more truth you wish they understood. That urge comes from the emotional conditioning the narcissist built within you, conditioning that taught you to explain your feelings, defend your heart, prove your intentions, and repair every crack they created. You were trained to respond, to react, to engage. So pulling back feels unnatural. It feels uncomfortable. It feels like you're betraying yourself. But as the days pass, the silence starts revealing its purpose. You begin noticing the absence of chaos. No arguments erupt out of nowhere. No emotional traps. No guilt trips trying to pull you into a conversation you don't want to have. No sudden mood changes that leave you confused or drained. No accusations that twist your reality. No unpredictable outbursts. No false promises to lure you back. You begin realizing that the absence of contact isn't just a lack of communication. It's the presence of peace. And as peace settles in, you begin to understand that you are not responsible for bridging the communication gap. You start seeing that the relationship was sustained by your effort alone. Your texts, your apologies, your explanations, your emotional labor, your forgiveness, your attempts to fix what they consistently broke. When you stop contacting them, the relationship truly ends because the narcissist relied on you to keep it alive. That awareness is painful, but it is also liberating. It shows you that your silence is not a weapon. It is truth. The longer you remain silent, the more you realize you are reclaiming parts of yourself that you lost. You begin protecting your spirit instead of sacrificing it. You begin prioritizing your emotional clarity over their emotional chaos. You begin valuing your inner stability more than the illusion of connection. And slowly, without even noticing, your silence becomes a boundary, a shield between you and the pain they once caused so effortlessly. Meanwhile, the narcissist interprets your silence as defiance. They don't see it as healing or self-respect. They see it as rebellion, as loss of control, as a threat to their ego. But what they interpret doesn't matter anymore, because your silence is no longer about them. It's about you reclaiming authority over your emotional space. It's about you no longer allowing your heart to be a battlefield they walk in and out of whenever they please. It's about you protecting your worth, even if they never recognized it. This boundary becomes stronger each time you resist the urge to break the silence, each time you choose peace over chaos, each time you remind yourself that you don't owe them your voice, your energy, or your emotional access. You begin realizing that silence is not something they forced on you. It is something you are choosing for your own survival and growth. And this choice becomes powerful because it marks the end of their influence on your emotions. Your silence teaches you self-control. It teaches you patience. It teaches you detachment. Most importantly, it teaches you that not every connection deserves to be revived. Some connections only exist to drain you. Some connections only exist to confuse you. Some connections only exist to diminish your worth. And the moment you accept this truth, your silence becomes unshakable. As your boundary strengthens, your mind becomes clearer. You begin reflecting on the relationship not with longing, but with understanding. You see the manipulation for what it was. You recognize the emotional abuse you once excused. You acknowledge the times you silenced your own needs just to keep the peace. And each realization strengthens your resolve. The silence no longer feels like an empty space. It feels like a protective wall built from every lesson you've learned. Eventually, the urge to break the silence fades. You stop checking your phone. You stop wondering if they'll reach out. You stop replaying old conversations. You stop expecting them to change. Your silence becomes the final chapter of a story you are no longer rewriting. It becomes the evidence of your growth. It becomes the proof of your healing. It becomes the boundary that separates who you were from who you are becoming. And the most beautiful part, you start to feel lighter, calmer, stronger, freer. Your silence becomes your victory, not because it punishes them, but because it protects you. It becomes the space where your self-worth rebuilds, where your clarity sharpens, where your spirit breathes, and where your future begins. This is why your silence becomes your boundary, because it is the first time you choose you. When the silence stretches long enough for you to finally breathe without bracing for the next emotional explosion, something inside you shifts. You begin to realize that the moment contact stopped, it wasn't the end of a relationship, it was the beginning of your rebirth. It's strange how stillness, something that once terrified you, becomes the very thing that teaches you what strength truly feels like. Your rebirth doesn't happen in a single moment. It unfolds inside you slowly, like dawn entering a dark room. When the noise of their manipulation disappears, when the chaos stops demanding your constant attention, you start hearing yourself again. Your mind, once tangled in confusion and emotional exhaustion, starts creating space for clarity. You begin to understand that life doesn't end when someone stops validating you, questioning you, or pulling you into cycles of pain. In fact, life begins when you are no longer trapped in those patterns. This rebirth starts the moment you understand that silence is no longer a punishment, but a form of freedom. You spent so long thinking their absence was a reflection of your worth, as if their withdrawal was proof that you weren't enough. But now you realize it was never about being enough. It was about them needing control. Without control, they disappear. Without power, they retreat. Your silence unsettles them because it means their influence over you is fading. They don't know how to exist without being the center of someone's emotional world, and the moment you stop supplying that emotional energy, their presence dissolves. But for you, something entirely different happens. You begin rising. At first, it feels subtle, almost unnoticeable, like your spirit is testing whether it's safe to stand again. You feel pieces of yourself returning, your self-respect, your intuition, your ability to trust your own thoughts without being guilted or gaslit. Slowly, you stop apologizing to yourself for things that were never your fault. You stop replaying conversations trying to decode their contradictions. You stop blaming yourself for the version of them you never received. Your rebirth is emotional, mental, spiritual. It's the moment you realize that their presence was never peace. It was pressure, confusion, insecurity, and doubt. You spent so long surviving that chaos that you didn't realize how heavy it was until it finally lifted. When the silence comes, you feel the weight fall off your chest. For the first time in a long time, you're not walking around with emotional tension wrapped around your body. Your nervous system begins to relax. Your mind begins to soften. The world starts to feel less like a battlefield and more like a place you can breathe in again. You start dreaming differently, thinking differently, choosing differently. Ideas and visions for yourself that were buried under emotional survival start coming back to life. You begin exploring who you are outside of being someone's emotional caretaker. And the deeper you go into this new space within yourself, the more you understand how much of your identity was shaped around keeping them satisfied, stable, and comfortable. Rebirth is not about becoming a new person. It's about returning to the person you were before the pain. You start reclaiming the energy you gave away so easily. You start realizing that your heart is not something to be taken for granted. You start noticing that you were never meant to live in emotional starvation, waiting for crumbs of affection. And the most powerful part of this rebirth is the understanding that you don't need closure from them. The silence becomes your closure. The peace becomes your closure. The clarity becomes your closure. You realize that the ending was a blessing, not a loss. You realize the silence that once scared you is now protecting you. This transformation is not loud or dramatic. It is steady, deep, and undeniable. You begin trusting your decisions again. You begin setting boundaries without fear. You begin understanding your worth is not tied to who chooses you, who leaves you, or who tries to come back when they feel bored or lonely. And as your confidence grows, the emotional hold they once had over you dissolves completely. Their absence no longer hurts, it liberates. Their silence no longer confuses you, it confirms everything you needed to know. Your rebirth is the moment you realize that walking away wasn't weakness, it was wisdom. Staying silent wasn't defeat, it was strength, and losing them wasn't your downfall, it was the doorway to the life, peace, and self-love you were always meant to claim.